sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into this federal funding freeze that seems to have come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's been all over the news.
Right.
So we're looking at a CBS News article about it, and it's pretty wild what's going on here.
Yeah.
So the White House, late at night, they dropped this memo. And it basically puts a freeze on federal assistance programs.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting is this memo from the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB, essentially put a freeze on these programs, but they're very vague on the specifics.
Yeah, super vague. Like, what exactly does that mean for all these different organizations and people who rely on this funding? And we're talking nonprofits, universities,
Right.
small businesses, even state and local governments. They could be affected.
Yeah.
And it's not just the scope, but the language that's raising some eyebrows.
Yeah.
The memo specifically calls out programs that are related to DEI, woke gender ideology, and the Green New Deal. What do those things even mean in this context?
Right.
The memo doesn't really say.
Right.
And that lack of clarity, it's got a lot of folks concerned about the potential for things to be politically motivated. You know? Like, are they just going to be targeting specific organizations that they disagree with?
Potentially.
So let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
When we say DEI, we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
Right.
These are things that have become more and more common in organizations.
Yeah.
Woke gender ideology, this is a much more kind of loaded term.
Yeah.
Often used by folks who are criticizing views that challenge traditional gender roles. And then you have the Green New Deal, which is this broad policy platform focused on climate change and social justice.
Right. Right.
So all of these things, they're very broad, and because the memo doesn't define them,
Right.
it really leaves the door open for interpretation.
Absolutely, yeah. That broad interpretation, it could impact a lot of different organizations.
Right.
Social justice, the environment, diversity initiatives. They might be wondering, is our work going to be deemed unacceptable? Are we going to be eligible for funding? All of a sudden, they're questioning everything.
Yeah, and that's a real concern, right? That
Yeah.
this could have a chilling effect on progress in all these areas.
Absolutely.
It's like, you don't want to do anything that could be perceived as stepping out of line.
Right, exactly.
The article highlights a few examples of organizations that are particularly worried. So you have Head Start, this program that provides early childhood education for low-income families. They're concerned about how this might impact their ability to serve, hundreds of thousands of children.
Right, and the impact goes way beyond education. Think about organizations like Meals on Wheels, delivering meals to homebound seniors. This is, sometimes their only source of a hot meal. The National Council of Nonprofits even called this a potential 5-alarm fire for the entire sector.
A 5-alarm fire.
Yeah.
That's pretty serious.
That's serious.
So you're saying, essentially, this memo has created a sense of panic.
Yeah.
It's created confusion, and there's this very real potential for things to be disrupted in a big way.
Yeah.
And these are crucial services we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's made worse because the White House, they're saying Medicare and Social Security, those are safe.
Okay.
And there's been some reports of problems with the online portals for Medicaid.
Oh.
So now people are wondering, well, is Medicaid on the chopping block too?
It's like they're adding to the confusion intentionally.
Right. It just adds more uncertainty to an already uncertain situation.
So we have this sweeping memo with unclear language. You have people panicking, potentially essential services being disrupted. And the White House is basically just saying, don't worry about it.
Well, they did try to downplay it. The press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, called it a quote-unquote temporary pause.
Temporary pause.
To ensure alignment with President Trump's executive orders.
Okay, but temporary pause doesn't really address the fact that this memo is so vague.
Right.
It doesn't tell anyone which programs are affected, how long this is going to last, or what criteria they're even using to determine if something is aligned with these executive orders or not.
Exactly. And you're talking about a lot of money here. Federal assistance spending. Think about it. Almost $3 trillion projected for 2024. Even a temporary pause on that could have ripple effects all across the economy.
$3 trillion, that's just a mind-boggling number.
It is.
It really puts this whole thing into perspective.
Yeah.
And with so much at stake, it's no surprise that lawmakers have had some pretty strong reactions. What has the response been like from Congress?
Well, the Democrats.
Yeah.
Furious.
Yeah, I bet.
Senate Majority Leader Schumer, he actually called the move lawless, dangerous, destructive, and cruel.
Wow.
He even went so far as to say it's illegal, unconstitutional, and that it targets everyday American families.
So he's not mincing words.
Nope.
What about other key Democrats in the Senate?
Senator Murray, she's the top Democrat on the Appropriations Committee. She didn't hold back either, called it a brazen and illegal move, and actually urged her Republican colleagues to put a hold on Russ Vought as the nominee for OMB director until the administration follows the law.
Okay, so they're really concerned that this freeze is just a way to circumvent the normal budget process.
Yeah, that they're trying to do an end run around Congress.
So a very strong, unified front from the Democrats against this freeze. Were there any Republicans who weren't on board with this?
Interestingly, yeah, Senator Graham actually took a more cautious approach. He expressed concern for agencies that depend on grant money, saying they need clarification from the OMB. So there might be some bipartisan concern about the fallout here.
Okay, so it's not a completely partisan issue.
Not entirely, no.
So what we're seeing is the White House basically flexing its muscles on spending.
Yeah.
But they're doing it in a way that is causing serious concerns.
Right.
Transparency, due process.
Yeah.
Is this all politically motivated?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions about that.
And this memo, it didn't just trigger strong words, it also triggered some legal action, right?
Absolutely. In fact, there were 2 lawsuits filed within days of the memo.
Wow.
First, a coalition of nonprofits, some big names in there. The National Council of Nonprofits, the American Public Health Association, they all filed suit looking for an emergency order to block the memo.
Okay.
Their whole argument is based on something called the Impoundment Control Act of 1974.
The Impoundment Control Act. I'm going to guess most people haven't heard of that.
Probably not.
What is that all about?
So back in the 1970s, there were concerns about presidents impounding funds, basically refusing to spend money that Congress had already approved.
Oh.
Think of it like this.
Yeah.
Congress, they're like the chef. They decide what goes in the dish.
Got it.
The president's the cook. They're supposed to follow the recipe. But sometimes the cook says, you know what? I don't like those mushrooms. I'm leaving them out, even though they're in the recipe.
Right.
So the Impoundment Control Act was passed to stop that.
Okay.
It made it illegal for the president to just refuse to spend money that Congress had already allocated.
So these nonprofits are saying this funding freeze is basically a way for the White House to just pick and choose what they want to spend money on.
Exactly. They're saying it's a violation of that recipe.
The Impoundment Control Act.
Right.
They're saying this is a way to just completely go around Congress and potentially starve programs that the president doesn't like.
Yeah.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And they're saying it sets a dangerous precedent. It undermines the balance of power between the branches of government.
Right, because if the president can just ignore what Congress decides, that really throws things out of whack.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about that second lawsuit? Who filed that one?
That one came from a bunch of Democratic state attorneys general, and their argument is all about the constitutionality of the freeze.
Okay, so 2 different lawsuits, both challenging the freeze.
Yeah.
One focused on the Impoundment Control Act, the other on the Constitution. This sounds like a pretty big legal battle.
It is, yeah. And it has huge implications for the future of federal funding and executive power.
I mean, this is really a question of how our government operates. Who gets to decide how our money is spent?
Exactly. And is the president allowed to just override the decisions of Congress?
It's like we're suddenly in the middle of a constitutional law class.
Right, except it's real life and it's affecting millions of people.
Yeah. And this is just the beginning. These lawsuits are in the early stages.
Yeah, who knows what's going to happen next?
A lot of twists and turns ahead, I'm sure.
Absolutely. But before we dive into all that, let's take a step back and look at what happened with the judge who put a pause on all of this.
Oh, right. Judge Lauren Alicon. Right. What exactly happened there?
So Judge Alicon issued a stay on the freeze, which basically put the whole thing on hold. This means the freeze can't be enforced until the court has time to actually consider all the arguments and decide if the freeze is legal.
So a little bit of breathing room for all those organizations and people who are worried about losing funding.
Yeah, for now. But it's important to remember this is just a pause, not a permanent solution.
Right. It's not over yet. The legal battle's far from over.
Exactly. The players are still on the field, everyone's just waiting to see what happens when the game starts again.
So the clock is ticking, but at least for now, the funding freeze is on hold.
Right.
What about new funding decisions? Does this apply to that as well?
That's a good question. The stay only applies to existing programs that are already getting federal funding.
Okay.
It doesn't affect new funding decisions.
So there could still be disruptions for organizations that are hoping to get new grants or contracts.
Exactly. There's still a lot of uncertainty out there.
Imagine you're an organization, you're about to get this grant, and suddenly everything's frozen.
Yeah.
No explanation.
And the worst part is there's no telling when things will go back to normal.
This whole situation really highlights how vulnerable these organizations are relying on that federal funding.
Absolutely. The lack of communication, the suddenness of it all.
It's just created chaos and anxiety for so many people.
Yeah.
And then on top of all this, the article mentioned that Russ Vought, President Trump's nominee to lead the OMB, he actually agrees with the president that this Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
So the administration might be willing to challenge this law that's been around for decades just to have more control over spending.
Yeah, it really shows how deep this ideological divide goes.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. This vaguely worded memo, people confused, potential disruptions to vital services, strong reactions from lawmakers, 2 lawsuits, a judge hitting the pause button, and now this revelation about the OMB nominee.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. What does all this mean for the average person listening to this right now? What are the key takeaways from all this?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that this is a fluid situation.
Things are changing all the time.
Exactly. What we know today could be different tomorrow. So stay informed, follow the news closely as this develops. And it's not just about staying informed, right? This isn't just some political drama happening in Washington. This is real. It has real consequences for people and communities all over the country. And the vagueness of this memo, that's a huge red flag.
Yeah, it's like, how do you plan for something when you don't even know what that something is?
Exactly.
These organizations depend on this funding.
Right. How can they make plans, make informed decisions? It's impossible.
And we need to pay attention to the words they're using too, right? Woke gender ideology, Green New Deal social engineering. Those are loaded terms, very open to interpretation.
Absolutely. And that raises concerns about bias. Are they going to discriminate in how they make funding decisions?
Yeah. It's like they're saying these things are inherently bad without giving any evidence or explaining what they mean by it. It could have a really chilling effect on important work being done.
Yeah, social justice, environmental protection, diversity and inclusion, all those areas could be affected.
And the fact that those lawsuits were filed so quickly?
Right.
That tells you how worried people are. They think the administration is overstepping, that they're doing something illegal.
And harmful. And the speed at which those lawsuits were filed, it tells you how urgent this is. People are viewing this as a threat to our democracy. You know, separation of powers, rule of law, transparency, accountability, all that is being called into question.
It's not just about the money. It's about the principles.
Exactly. This is about checks and balances. That's how our system is designed.
Right. We don't want any one part of the government to have too much power. So with those legal challenges happening now,
Yeah.
what are some of the main arguments? What could happen?
Well, one big argument is about that Impoundment Control Act of 1974.
Right. The one we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that law is designed to stop the president from just freezing funds whenever they want.
So Congress is in charge of the budget. The president is supposed to spend the money how they decide.
Exactly. Those nonprofits who filed that lawsuit, they're saying this freeze completely violates that law.
That they're going around Congress?
Cutting off programs just because the president doesn't like them.
And what about the state attorneys general? What's their argument?
They're more focused on the Constitution.
Oh.
They say this freeze violates the separation of powers because it gives the president too much power over spending. And that's supposed to be Congress's job.
So it's really a debate about who has the final say.
Exactly. Congress. The president. It's about the balance of power. And remember, there's also the issue of discrimination. That vague language in the memo, woke gender ideology.
Right.
That raises the question of whether they're targeting certain groups.
Yeah. Does this violate their First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association?
Those are all questions the courts are going to have to consider.
So we have these legal challenges, potential constitutional issues, and no one knows what's going to happen with all these programs and organizations.
It's a mess.
Definitely a mess. And this is all still developing, right?
Oh, yeah. We're getting new information all the time.
Right.
And those legal battles, they're just starting.
Right.
The judges stay. That was a temporary win for the people who oppose the freeze.
Right.
But it's not the end. We have to wait and see what happens next.
And all those organizations and people, they're just stuck waiting.
Yeah, this whole thing shows how important transparency is and accountability in government. When things are decided in secret, without any explanation or chance for the public to weigh in, it undermines trust. It creates opportunities for people to abuse their power.
It's like we're all watching this play.
Uh-huh.
We don't know how it's going to end.
Yeah.
But this isn't just a play.
This is real life.
This is affecting our lives, our communities.
Exactly. And we can't just sit back and watch. We need to be involved, be informed, hold our leaders accountable. What do you think? What does all of this tell us about where our government is right now? What challenges are we facing as a society?
It really feels like we're seeing how strong our government is. Like if something goes wrong, can it handle it?
Yeah.
What happens if things break down? What can we do if we feel like the government isn't working for us anymore?
Man, those are big questions. Tough ones, too. But I think it starts with awareness. We got to be informed, engaged, and we got to hold our leaders accountable. We can't just sit back and watch.
No, we got to be active. This is a moment that demands our attention. We got to be part of the process.
Yeah, this whole thing reminds me that our democracy, it's a work in progress, you know?
Yeah.
It's not something that just runs on its own. We have to be vigilant. We have to work to maintain those checks and balances.
All right, keep things in check. Well, we covered a lot today, from that initial memo to the lawsuits, the judge's stay. It's a lot to unpack. But hopefully you have a better idea of what's going on now.
Yeah.
And this isn't over yet. This whole thing's still developing.
Oh, yeah. Those legal battles are still going on. We'll see what happens next with this funding freeze in the weeks and months to come.
So stay tuned, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Right.
This is your democracy. Your voice matters.
Always keep asking questions. Get different viewpoints. And push for a government that actually represents the people.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those brains buzzing.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll.